Welcome everybody to the Bright Talk Live event here today. We're very, very proud. We've got a great panel in front of us. We're here at AWS reInvent 2018 in Las Vegas. This is it's a big event. Us and 45,000 of our closest friends here who are in town. There's obviously a lot of stuff going on. If you've been watching online, you may have caught some of the early stuff that's already been released. We're going to see live keynotes over the next couple of days. If you're watching live, if you're watching recorded, of course, you can go back and watch those. I'd like to welcome you. My name is Eric Wright. I'm going to be the moderator today for our panel. We've got a great set of folks. We're going to talk about multi-cloud in the age of serverless and DevOps. And this is sort of fun because it's there's sort of buzzwords that have been wrapped around what we're going to talk about. We're going to unpack and unravel what some of those things mean and what we've seen in real life situations. And we've got some folks who've really seen some exciting ways that these are playing out in real production environments. We're going to talk about that. We can take live questions from the audience, so make sure you feed in. We can take them right here. I'll keep an eye on it. So if we have questions, we can hit them along the way. With that, I'm going to introduce our panel. I welcome Arabella if you want to start, and let's introduce everybody.
Sure, thank you. My name is Arabella Hallowell, Senior Director, Strategic Marketing, NetScout. NetScout's been helping organizations for almost 3 decades, about 90% of Fortune 100 enterprises, about 90% of the world's largest communication service providers really troubleshoot some of those difficult, challenging application and service issues. And as we've seen some of this disruption, over the past few years, and particularly here at this event, we're really sort of helping organizations look at this next frontier, look at the visibility and the management challenges, and how do they manage the complexity with, this new frontier of what they're doing. So really excited to join the panel and discuss these issues for our customers.
My name is Leonid Igolnik. I head engineering at SignalFx, where let's say we build observability tools for this brave new world of new architectures that continue to emerge. Been with the company for a while. Been in this space since late 90s, building B2B applications. Before they were called SaaS, we used to be ASP. There were a variety of names. Spent some time at Taleo when we were trying to convince the world that SaaS is still a thing, and will be a thing in the future. That was an interesting journey for us. And been both a customer of observability tools. Used to be a third customer of AppDynamics when the company was just getting started. Used to be a vendor in this space as well. I run engineering for CA APM for a while. It's good to be on the vendor side. And it's been an interesting evolution of generational of tools as well as generations of architectures and how those things coexist. Is one of the things that I'm excited to speak today.
Fantastic. And I'm Simon Jones. I'm the VP of Marketing over at PubNub. PubNub is a company that runs the world's largest data stream network. So what's a data stream network? What we do is we help people to build applications with real-time features. So it really does 3 things. It helps you to connect any device known to man reliably and securely. We have 75 SDKs, something along those lines. Once you get them connected, you've got to do something with that connection. So we help to deliver data from anywhere to anywhere in under a quarter of a second, which allows you to do true real-time experiences. And the third thing, which I think is kind of why we're in this conversation, is we deliver control in the form of serverless computing at the edge. So you can think of the network as a third programmable layer, and you can program things to happen as data crosses it. So for instance, if we imagine that we have a chat and I speak English and the person at the other end speaks Spanish, as I press send, the data hits the network, it bounces out to an AWS ML thing, translates it into Spanish, pushes it along, gets it to the other end, they respond in Spanish, same thing happens, and it happens so quickly that you can't really tell that we both speak different languages. Fun fact of the day, although you may or may not have heard of PubNub to this point, we actually send more messages every day, twice as many messages actually, as Snapchat, Twitter, and the global SMS network combined. We just worked that out. Isn't that fun?
Excellent. And I guess I've got to give a shout out to my team. I'm the technology evangelist at Turbonomics, so some credibility in being out in the field and doing this came from the customer space. So it's exciting. Definitely, I'm honored to share the panel with your teams because you have all got really, really good experiences and we want to draw on them. I want to start with the simplest thing, which is defining what multi-cloud really is. It's as I walk the floor and I speak with folks and I find that there's a real question about what everybody's interpretation of multi-cloud is, and we'll sort of roll along. I'd love to hear your thoughts and what your context of a multi-cloud implementation is, and especially even a successful one.
Sure, yeah. So I would say, and it's difficult to say even traditional, but I think how most people, I don't know who the most people are, but most people traditionally think multi-cloud is really using several public cloud providers for different applications, services, or workloads. I think it's almost a false definition because, you also hear hybrid cloud, which typically means, any combination of having something on-prem in a more physical data center using, also a combination of a virtual or software data center and also some public cloud. And I think the hybrid cloud and the multi-cloud, to me, it all becomes one kind of unified cloud. I think that these multi-cloud and hybrid cloud definitions more and more are becoming one, and it's, they have to become unified.
I think in my experience, I've seen people look at multi-cloud for a variety of reasons, one of which is vendor neutrality. There are certain spaces where you have to have the vendor neutrality, and those are more homogeneous loads that run in different deployments based on geography, capabilities. To this day, AWS is still not offering every single service in every single instance. So sometimes to serve the customers in a particular geographical region, you end up having to go to other vendors. We're also a monitoring vendor. A lot of our customers deploy on AWS, GCP, Azure. So monitoring applications that run on AWS from AWS can be a challenge when AWS has an outage. So that's one way of looking at multi-cloud. I think the other dimension of looking at multi-cloud is taking advantage of the best things each of the cloud providers has to offer. For example, for a while, I think Google was leading with their machine learning capabilities. Amazon started, 12 years now? S3 was the first service, probably the most robust data storage out there. So I think the other way to look at multi-cloud, depending on your workloads and how do they match to the provider's capabilities or certifications, taking advantage of individual providers to play up to their strengths, not necessarily running every workload and every environment. And that's an interesting dimension for a lot of the customers we're talking to.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point. I think when we started talking about multi-cloud, kind of people had this idea that they could put the same app on servers provided by different public cloud providers. And over the last, 2-3 years, we've realized that doesn't really work especially well. And so when I do talk to folks who have a successful multi-cloud environment, what you discover is they put this thing over here and this thing over here, and never the twain shall meet. And now they're starting to work out how can I use the different services. But one of the things we were talking about earlier was really sort of this sense that there's now a need for an intelligent services layer, right, that allows you to use those different pieces across the different clouds. Because the reality is nobody who runs a public cloud has a financial interest in making it easier for you to take some chunk of your business and put it on somebody else's place. And I think it's unreasonable to ask someone to operate against their economic interest. So I think as we move forward, it's not just picking those best-in-class pieces, which I think you're absolutely right, that's where people are going. It's also looking at the intelligent services that sit on top of it. So for instance, the monitoring, right? Yep. That has to be multi-cloud. It's not going to be a part of a cloud per se. And similarly with the work that PubNub does. We built a multi-pop network that is specifically designed to get small bits of data, messages if you will, distributed incredibly quickly. Sort of doesn't matter which cloud they're sitting on per se. This is a very specially designed thing that sits on top of them. So it would never replace a cloud, but it does make a cloud more valuable and opens up the possibilities.
It's really interesting that you say that, because also going back to your earlier point, I think that this, I'll call it services layer on top, whether it's for monitoring or visibility or for other purposes, is because ultimately the user and the business owner, even though originally they were kind of, I want these types of latency or service levels, or it needs to be in this certain geography. actually having that end-to-end visibility, the end-to-end visibility of figuring out or capability to see what's happening is incredibly difficult for the organization, because they've got all of these different pieces in different places, and actually figuring out what's happening, well, how's my service doing, are my customers impacted, am I meeting my regulatory requirements, is very siloed. So even though people took this service provider is great at this thing, or this one's great at this one, and it was often the app owner or the business owner that was making that decision, it's now oftentimes the more traditional IT organization that's stuck with how do we manage it, how do we secure it, how do we make sense of it. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think we haven't fully seen the market deliver this intelligence services layer, and also I think the organization from a technology perspective is struggling to figure out how do I actually manage and monitor that environment.
And I think those struggles get even more complicated because we moved from a monolith in the early 90s, and maybe 10 years ago, we're starting to move to more complex architectures that require different tools to get better visibility into what's happening. The number of components you're now operating is increased an order of magnitude, to moving to things like polyglot environment, where you're no longer just doing Java or .NET or whatever your platform in choice, especially if you're trying to do the best of breed we talked about across multiple providers. You're probably doing some of your work in a variety of other languages. So not only the environments and the orchestrations and the tooling to manage the lifecycle of your artifacts, but also the variety of the artifacts themselves has increased to the point that I think IT organizations are starting to struggle with ability to manage that. And some of them are still early in their journey to what people talk about DevOps, and we're talking about DevOps in a multi-cloud environment. And let's take an organization that is still early in their maturity curve on that transition and toss additional key tooling, additional languages, additional architectures into that, and see what happens.
Yeah,
I think the one thing, and apologies, sorry, Simon, I'll come back to you in a second. We talk about DevOps, and I think that in itself needs its own definition, but if anything, the goal of DevOps was, and the folks that have been successful, we tend to see the same patterns emerge, and I would say the top two things are always, it's a culture of acceptance, a true, the ability to fail and learn, so definitely it's a high trust culture, and broad use of automation. And there's lots of abstractions that allow us to do stuff like that, and it's funny, as multi-cloud opens the doors that I would say you tend to be, if you've gotten towards the DevOps methodologies, you're probably going to land multi-cloud faster than if you attacked multi-cloud and you tried to bring in traditional practices. And it's funny. So Simon, you were about to say something as well. I'd be curious on your thought on this also.
Yeah, it's funny. I was going to share. I was at the Gartner Symposium, whenever that was, a few weeks ago. And I was standing around, I was talking to a CIO of a large company, and I said, so, how are you feeling about multi-cloud and hybrid cloud and all these fun things? He said, honestly, this move to DevOps is killing me. I used to have some guys and they'd rack and stack and I kind of knew what was going on, and someone said, put it in the cloud, you won't need as many people. He says, I got like 30% more people and we're not quite sure what the hell most of them do. I think you're exactly right. It's a cultural and automation thing, and I think as organizations get larger, the time it's going to take to get to really having an arm around the DevOps world and starting to feel the benefits that were promised when we moved out of the data center, it's going to take a long old time. And now we're trying to ask people to go beyond, right? We asked them to embrace the cloud, and they start embracing the cloud and working it out. I shudder to think how many APIs you're messing with already just on one cloud. And then you say, hey, how's about we shift it across 2 or 3? And they just look at you with pity in their eyes and wonder what on earth you're thinking.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, I think if you look at DevOps, historically the focus is more on dev, and also it was all about velocity, agility, let's get to business value, innovation faster, which is fantastic, and it's why we've seen some of the rate of progress and change. And we were talking about this earlier, I think that what has lagged, and you're seeing this even in, I would call it early adopter DevOps organizations, is really the ops part of dev, because most of devs focus on like the code and the quality and hey, is it working, did we get it? But when it comes to, I think your point, seeing all, how does it actually work once it's in production, and then the exponential complexity of often using microservices, components, and how much more difficult that is to manage makes it even worse, because you've got a traditional, I guess I would say a dev team that doesn't have that traditional discipline in ops, and then you're making their ops requirements even harder. And I think that's the big kind of, what's the word, chasm most IT groups need to cross. There isn't a really mature ops part that's emerged, as I see it anyway.
And I would argue that I don't think there's embracing multi-cloud unless you embrace DevOps first successfully.
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen anybody be successful at this, unless it's a truly silent lift and shift, kind of take one app, move it over here, because that's the better platform. But I would argue, and I've seen a lot of people trying to run before they learn how to walk from crawling, by embracing a highly complex set of technologies with variety of APIs that are still evolving, that are not always backward compatible, that are still not always well understood, and trying to go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in a day. And I think that leads to miserable failure, and all the promised land savings that folks think they will realize by being either multi-cloud or in the cloud, I don't think they materialize. It's not dissimilar to what I heard from some of the larger company CIOs, because unless you intimately understand how to do it right on the cloud, or you change how you go about running and operating your technology in the cloud, you won't be successful. It will be more expensive. The cloud providers have businesses too. They have profit margins to make, right? And at certain scale, your own data center will be cheaper. Maybe it's not the best thing to do for your organization long term. Maybe you're not getting the velocity, but if you didn't embrace the velocity enablers, I don't think you can embrace multi-cloud or even serverless effectively.
Yeah, it was funny, and a question came in from the audience to talk about does DevOps combine with containers and containerization? And I would say that definitely it's a thing that I've seen. It's a great enabler. It's not the thing that allowed DevOps to occur, but it was something that allowed DevOps to become more effective, because it gave us consistent API accessible way to deploy infrastructure. It gave you consistent ways to package infrastructure. It's funny, 2 years ago, we couldn't have gotten this far in a discussion without saying the word Docker, right? And that's a come and gone. And not that they've come and gone, but that the greatness and this elusive nature of what Docker seemed to be doing, it was one of the big unicorn bets, and now we've kind of seen everybody kind of blast right by it and go to Kubernetes, which in and of itself, it's not solving the problem, it's maybe introducing the next set of problems, but it solves certain things. So I wouldn't say that containers created DevOps, but DevOps and containers happened to arrive around the same time. What are your thoughts? And Leonid, I'm actually definitely curious in yours, given that you've got a strong engineering technical background, did you find that container adoption accelerated, or was it a powerful enabler, or did it just happen?
So I grew up in Eastern Europe. We're skeptical folks by nature to begin with. So new technologies don't get me excited. I've seen a lot of fads. I still remember the age of, aspect-oriented programming will be the best thing that will happen. Actually, in my 20 plus years of software engineering work, containers actually were the most exciting thing that I think has happened. Because I agree with you, they don't create DevOps environments, but they certainly grease the skids to the point that no other technology has done. The fact that with a single click, I can take an entire SignalFx environment and deploy it on my laptop anywhere I go, with the same set of artifacts that are consistent across all stages of the life cycle, from development to testing to staging to the production environment, right? That's the biggest enabler, I think, that has happened to velocity, as well as to that smooth handoff. If you all remember, let's toss this thing over the wall and let the ops repackage it, reconfigure it, figure out how to do configuration management to the production environment. I think containers, and vendors come and go, whether it's Docker or Kubernetes or somebody else who will emerge as an orchestrator for this. Probably the most exciting thing that happened to me in the last 20 years of building B2B applications.
Yeah. Now, Simon, you've definitely, you've built specifically around not caring what's underneath it. Like you've architected towards anywhere.
Right.
What are your thoughts on containerization? Because we're going to jump into serverless next, because that has the sense that we're actually going back to proprietary.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think, look, containerization has been fantastic. It's introduced all sorts of new ideas. It's also reintroduced some old ideas. I'm reminded that let's say 20 years ago, because it's roughly that. I used to teach Lotus Notes. For those of you who are old enough to remember Lotus Notes,
I was Lotus Notes certified application developer and systems administrator.
there you go.
So
I used to teach all the classes, and I would run around the room at sort of 7:30 in the morning with a stack of floppy disks like this, using Ghost, right, and setting up the room for the thing. And so from my perspective, it's such an obvious concept. I think the challenge with containerization as it starts to scale, and I'm seeing this in a lot of places, is the ability to whatever you want to call it, orchestrate between the containers wherever they are. There's a lot of open source stuff out there that we think is going to be awesome, and then somebody comes up with a new brilliant idea, and 3 of the things you were expecting to use have dropped off between, whatever, 0.6 and 0.73a the third. And so it's sort of still the wild, wild west when it comes to taking containerization, taking it the next step. I think if you're in a relatively homogeneous environment, it's fantastic. As it gets more heterogeneous, it starts to get really, really tricky.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting back to the earlier point that containers are one of the most interesting development from a engineering perspective, and you see that excitement everywhere, particularly like in DevOps teams. Like, containers can just make me go faster, better anywhere. But to your point, I think this goes back to, and I think we were talking about it as well, like the tools maturity.
Yes.
We're now at this point of such a fast pace of adoption and change, whether it's multi-cloud, containers, and we'll talk about serverless too, that you've got sort of this one set that's really, really quickly adopting stuff. Some of that is driven by business saying, go, go, go. But to your point, that heterogeneity and the ability to be anywhere, everywhere, that's what the business expects. The business expects, I want things on my terms. I want it to have these types of service levels. I'm not going to accept latency, particularly if you're a service provider and you're, doing things with 5G, or you're a gaming company with a 5G app or something, or some type of, you've got latency, you've got availability, you've got security. People have got business demands. Containers are helping them get to new heights, but this layer where how do you manage it, where's the, how do I actually manage what's going on, becomes harder and harder. Like, there are no borders anymore, yet everyone manages things as if they're, in their own local country. And so, I know all 3 of us are actually from different places, and so it's sort of interesting. Like, I think in IT now, everyone is from nowhere, you know what I mean? And how do you manage that?
The other interesting thing about containers is, we went from the world where I could walk through a data center floor, open a door, and point to a server and say, this is the identity management thing, or this is the workload orchestrator, to the point where those workloads are now spinning up, spinning down, moving away, getting killed by cloud vendors just because they have to do maintenance, right? The tooling to manage that movement and that almost swirl of activity that happens on the systems requires a completely different set of tools, as you mentioned. I think requires also a completely different set of mindset by the IT organizations. Security is something you mentioned. I had an opportunity to hang out with John Willis recently, who's considered one of the fathers of the DevOps movement. And John is moving from DevOps because he believes that people got it. It's a thing. We're going to go there, to another forgotten thing, which is DevSecOps, which is his new theme, I think, for the next year. Because when it comes to tooling, securing our environments and the information our customers entrust us with, not just monitoring it, becomes another interesting challenge. And container security, like any other new technology, started like a Wild West and have been a completely free fall for a while. And that's another example where sometimes people adopt technologies by watching other more forward-looking or companies with different risk criteria adopt technologies. And one of my favorite advice to folks that ask me for advice about containers and serverless is, you're not Netflix, right? Don't try to be like Netflix. Don't talk. I've seen folks come to me and say, hey, well, Netflix give everybody root on production. Well, great. Last I checked, they overpay and they don't hire junior people. Of course, they can afford to give everybody root on production, right? So we as an industry historically had this cargo culting environment where we would see something without realizing what it is and try to bring it into environments where it doesn't belong. I was talking to somebody who's working in the financial industry about running chaos engineering and chaos monkey on an ATM network. And I politely asked him never to do that because I like access to my money. So I think one of the unmet challenges we have in this environment is not just educating folks on new technologies and new environments, multi-cloud, DevOps, containers, but also helping them understand where on the maturity curve and how to move along that maturity curve in the adoption of those new technologies.
Some of it to me is also, I think, organization. So I've been kind of in the technology industry, I guess, 23, 24 years, and humans are unfortunately kind of difficult people and often resistant to change. And even when you hear about DevSecOps, and some organizations are moving there, typically the security team has been separate from your infrastructure team, but definitely your application team, and the idea of it being integrated in, I still think seems a long way away, because the security team is built to protect, to kind of build walls, right? And this is an environment that has no walls, right?
Yep.
It's a data center without no walls. You're talking about services, with no identity, well, with an identity, but services with no borders. And so how can technology teams and mindsets and processes change that quickly? I think that's the struggle too.
What do you think of the history in what we got through the greatest agents of change? And I find this as fascinating. I'll find somebody's like, I am an agent of change.
Yeah.
They're the ones that come in, they're the disruptors. And then you tell that disruptor, like, okay, perfect, you want to come in, you want to run Kubernetes, you want to do all this stuff. They'll lay down the technology stack. And then I'll say, perfect, except that we're actually going to deploy this application. We're going to run it as Ruby on Rails, and we're going to choose to run it on Heroku. Oh, and they'll be like, no, we can't do that. I'm like, oh, but we're agents of change. We can jump on the fly, but it's agents of change with comfort in history. And so it was a funny thing, and this is the people thing, and I love that you've picked up on this people, process, technology, right? It was always in that order for a reason, is that we have to focus on what is it that the people are trying to do, what's the process by which they achieve that, and then let's attack the tooling that will get us to that goal. And you picked up on our earlier discussions before we got started, and do you believe that we are doing well in pacing with change, or do you believe that we are slowing down? I'm curious what your thought is of how well we are really truly driving towards new things as we get into serverless and other things, relative to where we could be if it wasn't for the fact that we were sticky people.
So, in my view, the people piece is the inhibitor. I think you definitely see movement, in apps teams, business teams, DevOps teams towards moving, but often again that's in their own silo of people, process, tools. I have to go, I want to go fast, and even you were talking about cost, often cost isn't even the driver. It's all about being velocity and getting my service out. I think when you look at most organizations, even early adopters, the network teams are still pretty much the same. I think the security teams still are kind of, that change is still going to take me 15 days. So, if you look at why people, often went to cloud, it was because, hey, my network team, my server team is telling me it's 45 days to do something, and I can sign up with it, AWS, and, I'll be there in a week.
Yeah.
And if you look at both large organizations and mid-sized organizations, still, I think the IT teams look very similar. You are seeing some disruptions, people who are actually taking their network teams and their infrastructure teams and their security teams and knocking them together and doing all kinds of things, but they're the few, and it doesn't always work out.
It's interesting. The most successful ones I've seen do that is, and we used to think in my previous gigs about the workloads that organizations run as type 1, type 2 workloads, your mission critical stuff, and you're starting to double with this thing on the side. The most successful organizations I've seen start to double with this thing on the side by finding a most forward-looking team in their organization, by smashing them together, as you said, putting them on the side and letting them experiment, and also figuring out how to best adopt those new set of scary or quite enabling technologies in a specific way that works for the risk profile, the technology profile, the people profile, the capability profile of their specific organization. Because I would argue that there is no one way to adopt AWS, GCP, serverless, cloud computing, microservices for every org. I used to have customers where most of the transactions, even though they start in a modern Node.js application, through the transaction flow will still reach into a mainframe one day. And that's a completely different world that you have to do the deal with than if you were digital native, born in the cloud company that doesn't have those layers of architectural, archaeological legacy to deal with, right? So I think the most successful folks I've seen take those forward-looking teams, smash them together, and let them experiment for a while before they figure out whether it works for them. And I think companies that do want to see how to do that have to enable that environment. They have to take those risks, and they have to pick workloads that are right for those types of risks.
Yeah, and I think 25 years into the tech industry, I think what you see is that progress doesn't, which way around are you? It doesn't go like this. It sort of goes like this. It goes in circles, right? You come up with a new thing, you do something exciting. That's the point where you go, oh right, that just broke 6 other things. So I have to retrench just a little bit and work it out. I mean, I'm old enough and ugly enough to remember when there wasn't a Salesforce.com, right? And everybody had to buy Siebel, and we all paid the $2,000 VIG for each seat. And along came, then they were, as you say, they were ASP first, right? Then they were whatever the hell they were. But at the beginning, you would go in and talk to folks, and they'd say, well, we tried it with like the telesales people because they don't have really valuable information. We're just not sure about storing stuff there. And slowly they'd work out, they get some people, they build the process, and now they could take the tech. And I think we're seeing this all across the board here on the cloud side. We got in, I think to your point, we got really comfortable with S3, feeling pretty good about storing stuff on the cloud, feels good, worked our way through, started
barring, setting the right permissions.
Or it accidentally falling over. But you know what I mean? So we got there, and then we rushed forward, and we got very excited. As you said, we got Puppet, and Docker, and Kubernetes, it's all moving, and I feel like we're reaching that point where the change makers have shown the change that could get made, and now we're sort of on one of those sort of retrenchment loops where we're coming back and saying, now we have to make it work properly. We're learning, for instance, I think this conversation has really revealed, don't think that moving to the cloud is a cost-cutting measure, because that's just not really the reality. It's great for velocity. So now that we understand its economic benefit, it's a whole lot easier to think about how we get something from it. But it took us zooming forward and then slipping back just a little bit to work it out.
Yeah, we had this thing, my favorite quote I heard, still can't attribute to who it was, but it was the cloud is cheaper as long as you're willing to pay more. It did. We saw that early. We called them the boomerang effect, right? Folks that would go to the cloud, and then they would suddenly have this incredible repatriation of workloads back on premises because they're like, oh boy, that didn't work out so well. And now what we've said is like, okay, how do we actually make it better and keep them there? So now I don't see that reversal going on as much. So the boomerang effect has gone away. Now, you talked greatly. I love this. Everything comes full circle, including this conversation. They've come full circle. We had the idea of this amazing, powerful, centralized system that runs all these online systems. One that one may call the mainframe, and mainframe had 2 environments, both online and then batch. Perhaps we would call them functions that ran on demand based on triggers that would run on data warehouse and large data pools. Sounds to me a lot like functions as a service, which ultimately drew us into this sort of serverless world, as we call it. And even in itself, we talked about serverless has different meanings, different people. Leonid, I want to call on you because you mentioned this. When people say serverless, we have to ask them, what exactly do you believe you mean?
That's right. As I talk to folks in the industry, I hear 2 versions. Some people think serverless is just somebody else's server. And some people think that serverless is the more traditional definition of functional programming, where we're not thinking about containers anymore. We're thinking about units of work, right? And those units of work, interestingly enough, are continuing to shrink smaller and smaller and smaller. So I think we as an industry still have some work to do to define what serverless is, because it seems to mean different things to different people. And I think that's actually started similarly with DevOps, as DevOps was emerging, it meant different things if you were a SaaS vendor, if you were an online company, or if you were a traditional on-premise vendor, right? So I think we, like anything else in full circle, we had to normalize that. And serverless is a very interesting environment. It's interesting that you bring the fact that there's nothing new under the sun. Right? We're going back to some of the old paradigms with new implementations. And again, we getting into the environments where the environment is shifting under us. And what's missing for me personally, because Lambda was out there for a while, every single vendor, I don't think there's a major cloud vendor who doesn't provide functional type of programming. Mm-hmm. What's lacking to me, again, is go back to the conversation where we started this, is tooling.
Yes.
Because the number of artifacts we're now managing has increased another order of magnitude, right? We went from a monolith to a microservice, and then we went to the serverless thing, which some people don't understand, don't have the right tools to manage, and also, interestingly enough, don't understand, because it's so abstracted away, nobody has canceled what I call the law of leaky abstractions, because those abstractions do leak every once in a while, because sometimes your serverless functions that run for 30 milliseconds will take 700 milliseconds, because, well, somewhere there is a server that has to warm up, right? Or somewhere there's an Amazon quota manager that just decided that you're out of quota for your service invocations. So both understanding of this environment, and actually I don't think it's, I used to work at CA for a while where we were one of the major tool vendor for good old mainframe. Those tools to help understand what's going on with your workloads existed and matured there over the decades that mainframe had an opportunity to settle in the industry. I think we're at the very early stage and very early workloads. And what scares me is when I see people embrace serverless without realizing the paradigm shift that is required and the skill set going back to people, that is required to be successful in this brave new world.
I completely agree, and I think it goes back to what you're saying about not just exponential complexity, but it's, we're going from something that, going back to mainframe or even, your server environment, you know who's responsible for that server. I want a new server in Australia. Oh, well, that's going to take you 45 days and blah, blah, blah. When you go to a serverless environment, it's not just lack of physical. It is an entirely new paradigm, because it's spinning it up, spinning it down, it's here, it's there, the elasticity in maybe this is too legacy a term, it's almost frictionless. And so the technology, I think, is almost too in advance of the people who can basically fathom what they're doing. You can kind of do it for a specific reason, but if you actually think about the system effects of, it's up and it's down and it's here and it's there, it's almost unmanageable.
And for me, one of the symptoms is you see some weird things people do in serverless, where it's like, hey, we have this Lambda function, but we have another function that warms it up. Seems like a bit of an overkill, right? Seems like something is not quite connecting.
They did it because they could.
Well, or we did it because we don't understand why our performance of our Lambda function is inconsistent as we go. We can't handle this. So we have this another thing that just constantly calls us to keep it warm. And the whole advantage of elasticity, cost savings, et cetera, is disappearing.
Because
it's a veritable Rube Goldberg machine that we can create. And this is the problem that we have, is that's this thing. We've got one thing that kicks the ball into the cup and then warms up the Lambda thing, and then it does the thing, right?
One of my favorite tweets on the internet from this Twitter account called the Honest Status page says, hey, microservices, because every outage is now a murder mystery. So think about that complexity with the microservices architecture, multiplied by another order of magnitude with a functionalist, proper Lambda or proper serverless or canonical serverless architecture, where trying to figure out how those components behave by themselves is difficult, but the interactions between, especially since you cannot use any of the traditional tool you used to from the previous generations, like APM. There's no instrumentation for a Lambda function. You have to rely on whatever provider will give you, or start hand coding instrumentation. And hopefully your provider emits something standardized, such as Open Tracing Standard or Zipkin or Jaeger from CNCF. But this is a brave new world where you're operating blind if you don't have those tools.
Yeah, the terrifying thing, I was just thinking about the thing I was going to say, and I'm almost laughing at myself before I say it, it's the time differentiation of the serverless environment. You mentioned, it might run in 30 milliseconds, might take 700. It's such a tiny amount of time, really. But in terms of building things out, there's so much variation, and indeed, even if you can catch it, there's not really an awful lot you can do about it in the interim 670 milliseconds. It does seem to me that, serverless grew quickly. We came up with some really fun ideas. I think what you just said was exactly right. People built some stuff because they could. Every now and then you bump across someone who's running so many functions through a Lambda server, they might as well just have an instance of a server and run it there. But I do think as we move forward, we're going to see the need for these functions as a service to actually be tuned to the environment they're used for. I don't think you go to Lambda and say, this is a great all-purpose tool, anything I want to run that's happening, I'll just put it all in there. I think we have to look for tuning to particular purposes, right? So, PubNub, for instance, we have a functions system that is specifically tuned, as I mentioned before, to programming data in motion as it runs across a network. So the latency requirements, or the latency SLAs on it are designed for that purpose. So if it took 700 milliseconds, you'd be all over us like white on rice, giving us a hard time. And I think you're going to see that across all sorts of different functions where we tune the kind of serverless to the thing it's going to do.
Yes. No, sorry, I was completely interrupting you. I was going to say, at least you can manage your, your end-to-end latency and say, hey, we said we were going to give you, X, and we gave you Y, and oops, and like maybe there's like a SLA.
SLA actually matters.
Yeah, exactly.
But what I think is really interesting, going back to even your point about like how do you do troubleshooting? If you think about troubleshooting, even in a more traditional environment, you often have 5 teams all saying, is it the app team, is it the network team, is it the infrastructure team, and that's when you can actually name the application. Is this application in this cloud, or even if it's in your data center? And because at NetScout we see customers deal with this all the time. When you're talking about serverless or even microservices, the number of dependencies and how do you ever trace back who's at fault?
That's right.
Or not even who's at fault, but what's at fault. And so if you can never figure out where the problem is, like what do you do? Like what's the war room for serverless computing? Like how would you figure that out? We're not tooled to do that right
That's
now.
right, it goes back to tooling. But I wanted to highlight one interesting thing about services, at least for me as the head of engineering, because people listening to us live may think it's all doom and gloom. There's one thing that does get me excited about serverless, and it comes to aspects that we touched on as one of the fundamental enablers of DevOps, which is automation and automated testing specifically. One of the things that does excite me about the continuing shrinkage of the unit of deployment is the lack of excuses that brings to the table when it comes to automated testing. The units in serverless computing, traditional service computing, like there's no excuse for any engineering team not to be able to instrument and write a test for this tiny Lambda function, where if you think about some of the more traditional approaches, the monolith, right, where you have to spin this up, you have to write a bunch of data somewhere to the database if you don't have the right frameworks. Or with microservices, it's still easier, but it's still a service that you have to spin up. I think one of the things that I'm excited as head of engineering to see where serverless evolves is ability to get quality and predictability in the environment, because that elusive 100% test automation coverage may be there, or we may get there, because as units, although people will abuse serverless, and I've seen functions of thousands of lines of code, like an ADI application. But I think as the unit shrinks, the ability to test them in a more predictable fashion will give us some of the benefits in return to some of the complexity that this paradigm brings to the table.
One thing that's it's good, I wish we had 8 hours to complete this discussion. I don't even think it'll be completed then. This has been powerful. We are getting ready to wind down, but I want to tap in onto one more subject before we go, which is serverless moving us backwards away from multi-cloud portability? Because most of the serverless function services, or functions as a service implementations, are proprietary. So I know actually good friend Erica Windish, she's doing really, really cool stuff. Company's IO Pipe, and she's here doing a lot of stuff and attacking this problem of like being the abstraction layer above serverless. And there's very few people that are in this space, probably because no one's figured out how to use serverless, let alone how to do multi-cloud serverless. So I'm hoping that Erica can really kind of nail that story down, and I'm eventually going to see more folks that are going to jump in on that one. But do you each believe that going back to proprietary systems that are tightened, well-tuned, localized, does that take us back away from what we believe multi-cloud is going to win us?
Not at all. I think it actually takes us to where multi-cloud's supposed to take us. If we try to write everything into a generic serverless space that exists in a cloud, that takes us away from multi-cloud. I think if we combine these, the things we've talked about over the last 45 minutes, about sort of having intelligent services that are tuned to particular purposes, that interact with clouds on an abstracted layer, totally takes us towards multi-cloud.
I think actually, well, we haven't disagreed on this panel yet, so maybe it's
Excellent. We're all in violent agreement all the way through here. We need some disruption here.
I actually think what we're seeing with service right now is what we saw with cloud computing and elastic computing in the early days. And then we talked about containerization showed up. We've seen moves like Kubernetes giving us at least more or less uniform layer across the providers. I think with serverless, like the canonical serverless with functional programming, we're still at the Wild West. And I think as the adoption continues and the critical mass does materialize, and you see some early movements by Google from earlier this summer, and others to start to create a layer that permeates multiple providers. So I actually think we'll see exact same pattern revolution as we've seen with cloud computing and elastic computing, where containerization gave us some standardization across those clouds. I think some of this will come for functions when we reach the relevant maturity curve. Not to take away from your point about, I think if you want to be multi-cloud in serverless or in elastic computing, you still have to think about what's the right best of breed solution for each of the clouds and what type of workloads matches the capabilities of that cloud the best.
Yeah, I think it goes back to how we started, which is I think the definition of multi-cloud needs to change. Right now it's kind of rigid around a collection of public cloud providers. I think as this conversation has demonstrated, really what multi-cloud is I'll just call it like a new data center without walls, right? Which is all of these technologies mean that the business and the IT group can have the service levels and the requirements they want anywhere, anytime, spin it up, spin it down. That's, I think, the promise of multi-cloud. I just think we need a new definition of multi-cloud. So I think your comment about is serverless taking us back? I think no. I think we just need to expand beyond, a public cloud provider is the only way that we can have the freedom that we want. I think it's all about having more freedom to do what we want, at as I said, the service levels and the things the business wants. And that, I think, is the new multi-cloud.
This has been very good, and definitely thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. Thanks to all the folks that have been watching live and the Bright Talk team that have made this possible. Obviously, PubNub, SignalFx, NetScout, and of course Arabella, Leonid, and Simon's. Your personal presence as well as just your company's bringing forward. Got to, again, shout out to my team at Turbonomics. Say hello to all the crew there. We're down, and if you're here at the live event, come and see all of our folks. Everybody's going to be in the expo hall. We've got a couple more days left to be on the ground. If you're watching us live, make sure you, speaking of live, watch the live AWS keynotes, which are going to be happening over the next couple days. It's always exciting to see, because inevitably there's one more thing left, and it's just a matter of what it's going to be. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. Thanks, folks. We'll wind it down now, and we'll catch you again. Keep your eyes on Bright Talk, of course. Follow us online, and look forward to getting a chance to do this again.
Okay,
Thank you, everybody.